Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leader series, Pioneer PFAS Remediation with Sustainable Results. My name is Megan Purdy and I'll be your host for today. Firstly, in keeping with our custom, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past and present. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being hosted with Engineers Australia's industry partner, Husker Australia Proprietary Limited. Husker Group is a globally recognised industry leader in geosynthetic solutions. With over 16 years of experience in the field, the company has established a reputation for delivering innovative and high-quality products that meet the evolving needs of its clients across various industries. Husker's comprehensive range of geosynthetic products includes geotextiles, geogrids, among others, that have been designed to meet the most demanding requirements, from civil infrastructure to environmental protection projects. With a global network of manufacturing facilities, distribution centres and technical experts, Husker is well positioned to deliver exceptional products and services that meet the unique needs of clients in different regions. Now today, we'll hear from two speakers followed by our live audience Q&A, so I encourage you all to please send your questions through to our speakers via the chat box. I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Malek Bouaza. Malek is a professor of civil engineering, boasting a global reputation in geosynthetics environmental geotechnics. As a fellow of the Institution of Engineers and a registered engineer, he has garnered numerous accolades, including the prestigious International Geosynthetics Society Award and Gold Medal. Malek has held visiting scholar positions at esteemed institutions worldwide, contributing significantly to advancements in his field. Beyond academia, he offers expert consultancy internationally, notably shaping landfill standards in Australia and advising on complex projects globally. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Malek Bouaza.
Thank you, Megan, for your kind introduction. 190 millions. This is the number of synthetic chemicals that are registered globally. Every 1.4 seconds in average, a new industrial chemical is created in the world. In other words, there is even a likelihood that we might have a new chemical created by the end of this lecture. So to put this in perspective, in 2020, more than 350,000 mixture of chemicals were registered globally. Currently, more than 140,000 chemicals are used in various industrial applications, and most likely a number of them will be classified as emerging contaminants in the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to discuss with you today how geosynthetics can minimize the impact of these so-called emerging contaminants. So let's talk about how geosynthetics could contribute to the betterment of our environment, especially in the context of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, an important consideration to take into account. The United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development expresses human development needs in terms of 17 goals shown here. We refer to them as the Ps. Two of these goals have a direct link with today's topic. And these are goals number 6 and number 11. Why? Because within these two goals, we have two targets, target 6.3 and target 11.6. Okay, target 6.3, which is a reduction of pollution and minimization of the release of hazardous chemicals, and target 11.6, which addresses the management of chemicals throughout their life cycle. This work is also in the context of what we refer to as space or operating space for humanity. This is a framework which was developed in 2009 based on planet boundaries to define the operating space within which humanity can continue to develop. The concept emerged from a recognition that human activities can lead to impacts at the planetary scale that threaten the vital Earth system processes that allow humanity to thrive. Crossing these boundaries increases the risk of generating irreversible changes in our environment. So in 2009, these 9 impacts were put in this framework. So the green zone you see, that's the safe zone. So what this schematics tells you that we have already transgressed 3 boundaries in 2009, climate change, biodiversity, and hydrogen cycle. Well, you can also see that chemical pollution was one of the original 9 impacts for which the planetary boundaries were postulated. Chemical pollution was not yet quantified at that time, but the reason why it was added is because it has global impact on ecosystems and our environment. It is also a variable that can affect other boundaries listed here. So we fast track this to 2023. Chemical pollution was renamed as the novel entities boundary and includes now emerging contaminants, radioactive materials, among many other materials. What we can also see that we have moved from 3 boundaries being transgressed to 6 now, and novel entities / chemical pollution is one of them, and we are really on the high risk zone. This, of course, presents us with much bigger challenge nowadays, as not only we have to deal with the emerging contaminant of today, but we also need to address the emerging contaminants of tomorrow. So how can we define these emerging contaminants? Probably the simplest definition is shown here. So the emerging contaminants are substances that are not yet fully regulated, but are being recognized as potentially harmful to human health and the environment. So PFAS, if you go back to that schematic on boundary, on the planetary boundaries, PFAS fall in that novel entities category and can be considered as a planetary boundary problem. Why? Because PFAS pollution is global in its scale. The effect of pollution from PFAS are only now being discovered after the pollutants, of course, are already globally spread. Now that the effect have been discovered, they are poorly reversible or irreversible in some other cases. So what are PFASs? PFASs are factory made chemicals used in industry and consumer products worldwide since the 50s. There are currently around 12,000 compounds which have been identified, and this number keeps increasing as our analytical tools are improving. They're useful chemicals. It's a useful chemical in reducing surface tension, so that's not surprising that we have seen them used in many industries and consumer products like non-stick cookware, food packaging, strain-resistant carpets and textiles, cosmetics, firefighting foams, just to name a few. So why are we concerned by PFAS? Or why should we be concerned by exposure to PFAS substances? Well, they can be pervasive and persistent, so they can spread widely. Consider now, for example, if you look at the half-life in water for some of these compounds, it can vary between 40 to 100 years or plus. They can bioaccumulate and therefore have adverse health effects. PFAS, for example, prefers to bind to blood and protein. On top of that, we don't know a lot about them. There is certainly a scarcity of information in literature an incomplete regulatory structure, at least when it comes to liners for waste containment facilities. That's the topic I will cover today. So the most frequently detected PFASs in leachate for waste containment facilities are the so-called perfluoroalkyl acids. In particular, the carboxylic acids, PFCAs, and the sulfonic acids, the PFSAs. So these PFAS can be categorized into long chain and short chain based on the number of carbon atoms they have. So long chain, for example, refers to PFCAs with 7 and more carbons. A good example of that is PFOA, and PFSAs with 6 and more carbons, such as PFOS. PFCAs and PFSAs with less than 7 and 6 carbons are referred to as a short chain PFAS. You also have another category referred to as the ultra short PFAS, and I will not cover this particular aspect today. So what makes the PFAS compound really complex to deal with is their chemical structure. So they are categorized by a tail, that's basically the carbon fluorine tail, and the functional head. So the functional head is non-unique head. It is hydrophilic, therefore loves water, and oleophobic, hates oil. It is strong to weak acids. On the other hand, the tail, the fluorocarbon tail, has very strong bonds. That's because the carbon fluorine bond is one of the strongest in organic chemistry, which makes the compound very stable. So the tail is the opposite of the head. It is hydrophobic and oleophilic. So it doesn't like water but loves oil. It is heat resistant. You need probably more than close to 1,000 degrees C to destructure it. And of course, you can have longer CF chains, which the longer they are, the more problematic they become. And that explains why they are persistent in the environment and are quite mobile in groundwater as well. So when they partition in the environment, they will partition through either an air-water surface or interface, which means that the head, since it is water-loving, will get oriented towards the water. The tail doesn't like water, so it will basically orient towards air. When you have oil in the mix, it creates even more headaches because now the tail, you know that it is oleophilic, so it loves oil, and the head is, of course, doesn't like water, or the tail doesn't like water. So you have this complex system where the three now, you have two interfaces, air, water, water, oil interfaces. That complicates the problem further. So how do we basically, when you look at PFAS, what are the major sources in the waste material? So the reason why we ask this question is because PFAS substances have been detected in landfill leachates in various parts of the world. So the major sources will be from industrial waste, which has been dumped in those sites, or waste from site mitigation, which is no longer the case nowadays. We don't do that. We also, it's linked to the household or consumer and household waste. When they reach the end of their functional life, typically they are dumped into landfills as part of the waste stream. Landfill fires in the past, or any industrial, commercial, consumer products landfill since the 60s and 70s. And this is more related to the legacy type of sites. So we do have a bit of regulation available to guide us in our designs of designing systems. An example is shown here. So for the Australian case, for example, we have the current regulation, the National Environment Management Plan, referred to as NEMP, in the second version. The third version is about to come very soon, that regulates these concentrations, acceptable concentrations for drinking water. So, for example, if you look at PFAS and PFHX, it's about 70 nanograms per liter. If you move to the right side, or at least my right side of the screen, you look at the other jurisdictions are quite different in terms of what is acceptable. Now, this wide variation in the guideline levels seen here reflects simply the differences in the perception of risks for these different countries. And also likely that linked to the uncertainty in the scientific approach taken to assess the risk. Just for a purpose of giving you an indication of the scale we are talking about, if you look at 70 nanograms per liter, that's equivalent to about 3.5 drops of liquid into an Olympic swimming pool. So you can imagine that what the 4 nanograms per liter will represent in a swimming pool. Now, if you look at this table gives you the PFAS concentration distribution in landfill leachates based on literature, of course, in various places around the world, including Australia and Victoria here in Australia. So what we can pick up very quickly from this table is that short chain PFAS tend to dominate over the long chain. So in this table, the 3 short chain are the top 3 in the table, and the bottom 3 are the long chain ones. Probably the exception is China, most likely due to the very high loading of long chain PFAS present initially in the waste as a result of their extensive use in manufacturing processes. Otherwise, the trend observed in this table stems from the fact that the PFAS manufacturers started to phase out the production of long carbon chain PFAS once they were added to the list of regulatory substances and replace them with short chain PFAS. However, the shift led to the use of much larger quantities of short carbon chain PFAS to obtain similar performance to long chain. And also the fact that the short chain PFAS tend to be more hydrophilic and water soluble than long chain, therefore they tend to be more mobile and can be released easily from the waste. Now, if you look at the same type of distribution now in aqueous environment at the airports and fire training facilities, we see the opposite. The long chain tend to dominate extensively over the short chain. And this tells us that when it comes to designing these on-site waste repositories or landfills and waste containment facilities in general, we have to be really aware of these differences because we cannot have one size fits all type of design to address different problems. So you look at these waste containment facilities, typically their liner configuration is shown here. So we have what we refer to as a single composite liner. This is what you see on the left side of the screen. And what we have is a combination of a geocentric clear liner, a geomembrane from bottom up. And on the right side, we also have what we refer to as a double composite liner. So it's the composite liner top multiplied by 2, basically, which gives you more redundancy in the system. Now, these geomembranes and geocentric clear liners are rarely used on their own. So they're typically combined to form these composite liners. So that's what will offer you basically, or what will mitigate the possible migration of contaminants from these sites. But these sites have not, if we look at these current lining systems, they were not designed to contain emerging contaminants. So let's see how these geomembranes and GCLs can cope with this new breed of contaminant. So if you look at our geomembranes, very often, in most of the guidelines anyway, we refer to the use of a high-density polyethylene geomembrane. And the reason why the preference is given to HDPE type of geomembranes is because they are durable and they are pretty good, they have pretty good chemical compatibility. The key is actually in the structure of the polyethylene. So polyethylene is a semi-crystalline polymer which has both crystalline and amorphous regions. So the crystalline zones represented here by the crystallite stacks you see, these are the lamella size that you see on the screen. These crystalline zones tend to act as impermeable barrier for the diffusion of contaminants. On the other hand, the amorphous zones, and that's where you have microvoids, they are really permeable since the polymeric chains are mobile and they are not densely packed. So if there is a diffusion, molecular diffusion taking place, it will be a function of the degree of crystallization and cross-linking. So if you look at high density polyethylene, which tend to be highly crystalline, and you compare it, for example, to a low density polyethylene, which is less crystalline, the diffusion will tend to take place more in the LDPE than the HDPE. So what happens once you have these leachates which contain PFAS in contact with the geomembrane? So in the case where the geomembrane is intact, in the sense that it has no defects in it, no voids, the only way that the contaminant can pass through the geomembrane, it will be through a molecular diffusion. And multiple factors can impact the membrane diffusive characteristics. These factors are typically influenced by the properties of the contaminant and the properties of the geomembrane. So one critical factor is the similarity of the contaminant, in other words, to the geomembrane. In other words, the polarity and hydrophobicity of both. So this factor will affect the contaminant, or will impact the diffusivity through polyethylene geomembrane, for example. So only the contaminant that can diffuse substantially through the geomembrane are those that can partition into the polymer comprising the geomembrane, which generally limits the diffusivity through the contaminant to organic compounds. So if we look at this process shown in the schematic, if you have a leachate on top of the geomembrane, it will partition on the top part of the geomembrane, then it will diffuse through the core of the geomembrane before it dissolves on the other side. So the current work we have conducted here at Monash shows that partitioning coefficient for these PFAS compounds are very low. For the long chain, they are around 2 or 3. For the short chain, they are close to 1. So both of these long chain and short chain tend to have this low partitioning coefficient. So the lower it is, the more time the fusion takes place. Therefore, it is very slow process. If other organic compounds have higher partitioning coefficient, means that they will diffuse quicker through the geomembrane. So at this point in time, what we know about these interactions between PFAS compounds and HDPE geomembranes is that it's a very slow process, and this has been confirmed by works of others recently. Now, if you move on to the GCL part of the problem, the geosynthetic clear liner, what is very important to understand is the way it is structured. So typically it's composed of sodium bentonite sandwiched between 2 layers of geotextile through a needle punching process. So the geotextile component and the fiber component offer the mechanical function, whereas the bentonite offers that sealing function. So that's what will interact with your contaminant. So if you look at some of the recent work on this compatibility between the GCL and the PFAS compounds, this is from a leachate, actually a real leachate from West Content Facility. The first thing that is interesting to see here is that it confirms the fact that the short chain tend to dominate over the long chain. So if you look at the short chain like PFBS and PFHXA, they are much higher in terms of concentration compared to the long chain like PFOS and PFOA. So when we have this leachate interacting with our geosynthetic clear liner, and typically we verify this through hydroconductivity test over a period of time. So if you look at hydroconductivity, it's pretty good. GCL1 DI water gives basically the reference baseline, and this is what the guidelines, basically the different jurisdiction will aim for. So when we look at the GCL compatibility with PFAS leachate, in terms of hydroconductivity, this is not a large difference. However, we should not be misled by these low values and assume that PFAS will be contained, because we need to look at actually what is coming out on the other side. And this is an indication of the range of concentration in the effluent part, what goes through the GCL and comes out. So in general, what we tend to observe is that the concentration in the effluent did not reduce much in the GCL. The small changes we have observed can be attributed to the presence of hydrophilic functional groups, basically the anionic head in the PFAS compounds, which offered certainly some capacity for absorption onto the bentonite component. So what should we do about this? Different type of GCL was actually produced, and this type of GCL had activated carbon in the bentonite. And it went through the same process of compatibility testing with two different leachates containing PFAS, similar to what was done before. And again, it shows pretty good permeability behavior. It's in the range of 10⁻11. So while the addition of this activated carbon didn't affect much hydroconductivity, the question is, did it have an effect on PFAS concentration? So let's see if it did. So if you look at the effluent part, what we can see very quickly from this diagram, it shows the effluent concentration versus pore volume of flow, basically versus time. This is about 3 years worth of testing done by our colleagues at GeoFabrics. What we can see initially is that the total PFAS dropped from the initial concentration to the limit of reporting within a couple of months. And then it increased again. And it appears that this activated carbon GCL provide a very good resistance to the migration of the long chain PFAS. As you can probably see, this is very low reddish columns at the bottom of the x-axis, basically. But not that much for the short chain. And the reason for that is because the short chain is more mobile, it is more hydrophilic, and it doesn't have much sorption potential. There's also likelihood that some degradation has occurred, which was attenuated initially. And also, it can be also the reason why this short chain concentration increased is most likely related to that. So it's difficult to immobilize. This kind of was confirmed through sorption tests conducted on these materials, and it shows that actually, if you look at the amended bentonite or carbon amended bentonite, it has very high sorption capacity when you look at this long chain. If you look at the short chain like PFBS, very low capacity of absorption. Of course, when they compete against each other, the long chain tend to dominate at the end. So if you put this in the context of a design, and we look at, for example, we try to evaluate the concentration of PFAS in an aquifer, and here we took the example of the Victorian guidelines through BEPM. So I look at typical composite lining system over a subgrade referred to as an attenuation layer, and then the aquifer is below it. And that's typical example. So we have 3 meters of aquifer, 2 meters in the attenuation layer, and we look at a hypothetical landfill site. So when you look at the migration of these contaminants, the worst case scenario typically occurs when you have a defect on the geomembrane. So we always design on the basis that all liners will leak. So therefore, the assumption that the geomembrane will likely contain defect, and to make things a little bit worse, this defect will be located on a wrinkle as shown here. So when you have these wrinkles with the defect on top, the transmissivity, therefore the intimate contact or the contact between the geomembrane and the GCL is of paramount importance. So if you have an intimate contact, means that you are reducing the transmissivity at the interface. If there is a poor contact, the transmissivity at the interface becomes higher, and therefore the wetted zone becomes larger. So when we look into this, we looked at high transmissivity, average transmissivity, and very high transmissivity, which reflects the type of contact we have between the geomembrane and the GCL, and it is reflected on the transmissivity values given in the first column of this table. What we tend to see is that leakage rate is pretty high. It's actually higher than what is allowed in Victoria, for example, which is 10 liters per hectare per day for type 2 landfills. The concentrations are also pretty high. So it takes about 90 years to reach 70 nanograms per liter. And the second case is actually for US EPA guideline 4 nanograms per liter, which is of course less. It will get there quicker. If the transmissivity is higher, so if we have poor quality installation, the time decreases because the transmissivity is much higher. Now, if you put this in the context of probability analysis, and in this case, what we are looking to, so you are looking at leakage rate based on the Victorian case, and the probability of exceeding leakage is related to what has been reported in literature. Probably the most extensive set of data we have available today, and that is related to monitoring of 120 landfill cells in the state of New York, where all these leakage data are reported in literature. So the probability of exceeding this leakage is related to that particular set of study. So in most cases, for example, if we take the 11.5 liter per hectare per day, this will be exceeded 90% of the cases if we refer to what has been done in the state of New York. If you look now at the concentration related to these leakage rates and the probability of the concentration being less, that's what you see on the diagram on the right side with the different jurisdiction guidelines. For example, Canada is 600 nanograms per liter. That's what is permissible. It means that in 70% of the cases it will meet. If you look at, for example, leakage rate or concentration of 535 nanograms per liter related to leakage rate of 136 liters per hectare per day, there's a likelihood of 30% of chances to be higher. If you move to the Australian guidelines, which is 70 nanograms per liter, there's only 10% chance that it will meet it. So basically it means that 90% of the of chances that it will not meet this concentration. So these are examples on how you can go about refining the design of your lining system. Now, we looked at the case where we had no GCL with sorption capacity, and we established this table earlier. Now, what if we now add a sorption capacity in the system? This will have a direct effect on the concentrations, but not on the leakage rate, because there are two different things. So the leakage rate is actually slightly higher because the permeability of the sorptive material is slightly higher. But the major impact will be on the concentration range. It is much lower than what we had initially. And if you look at the time that will be needed to achieve the guideline numbers, it's basically in the Australian case, it will never get there. In the US EPA case, it will take thousands of years to get there. But this is, of course, if you have a sorptive capacity that is enough to cope with PFAS. So there are a few options that you might look into. So this brings me to the concluding remarks. I think mobility is one of the major issues. When we look at the evaluation of the effectiveness of these lining systems for containment of PFAS, the information we have so far is very scarce. And this is mostly due to the newness of the PFAS contamination issue. And of course, the lack of information on PFAS mobility through these geosynthetic liners. One important aspect that we need, I guess, is a takeaway message here. It is important to differentiate between on-site repositories and landfill type of applications. So we should not lose sight of the importance of distinguishing between liner solutions for these two type of settings, because the challenges and performance requirements are different. Limitations of different types of geomembranes and GCLs for these applications need certainly to be acknowledged. What about the future? Our future is, I think you can probably summarize in one simple sentence. We need to gain better understanding of the complex chemistry of PFAS, which can actually become more challenging once we account for the presence of other contaminants present in the leachate mixes. This in turn will allow better appreciations of the fate and migration processes that will take place through the geomembrane and GCLs, which certainly currently are posing a significant hurdle to the development of liner system designs that ensure long-term environmental protection against PFAS migration. So this brings me to the end, and I would like to acknowledge a number of parties who were involved in all the work we have done so far. Without them, of course, we would not have been able to progress on the understanding of this compatibility between PFAS compounds and geosynthetic lining system. Thank you again for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Malek, for your presentation and insights today. I'd now like to welcome our second speaker, Gus Martins. Gus is a seasoned Director of Operations and Engineering with a wealth of experience in civil engineering, particularly in environmental and hydraulic projects, and has over a decade of experience overseeing a broad spectrum of infrastructure projects with a particular focus on environmental and hydraulic areas. In his current role as Director of Operations and Engineering, Gus brings his exceptional knowledge and expertise to bear on the development and execution of complex projects, ensuring the highest level of quality and efficiency at every stage. Please join me in welcoming Gus Martins.
Well, thank you, Megan. Thank you for introduction. It's always good to be back with Engineers Australia and sharing some light in this very important topic. Thank you, Malik, as well, for this great introduction about the topic. I think it's a lot of information to digest, especially with the number of contaminants that we see rising up again and again, every day, every second. But I also want to talk a little bit more about how can we find solutions for these problems. And one thing that we see quite often is people recurring to traditional solutions, or trying to mimic traditional solutions to solve a problem that is pretty much new. So I like to highlight this phrase where right is right, and everybody, even though it's everybody against it, and wrong is wrong, even though everybody's doing it. So there are a lot of colloquial and informal ways to say this, but we've been seeing a lot of people trying to mimic solutions that are commonly used for other applications and trying to pass the same alternative to PFAS. And as I'm going to show a few examples, this is usually not a very possible case, let's say like this. So I don't know if you guys ever heard about Jarvis Bay. This is an area located pretty much 200 kilometers on the south from Sydney, where we had a interesting case where a former defense base ended up contaminating surrounding areas with PFAS. The interesting part is that back in 2018, we saw some publications from the Department of Defense and from EPA in New South Wales talking about that there were no current evidence on the risk of consumption of PFAS. However, at the same time, the whole site was blocked for access, and we start seeing some different moves happening there. What I want to shed some light is this fact that despite everything was done accordingly to what the regulations were showing, all the information available, in theory, available was there, we saw some quite interesting developments afterwards. If we look into the timeline and how PFAS developed on the regulations and all the research about how harmful PFAS can be, we see that since 2002, so quite a long time back, these contaminants were already brought by OECD as a harmful contaminant. And the Australian government, on the Department of Health and Aging, also shared this report. So it's complex to assess a chemical so relevant as not harmful, even though we had some very irrefutable information on that time. A little bit later on, the Stockholm Convention also make a lot of noise about PFAS, and since then we've been seeing a lot of information and research, and the majority of them backed by very large organizations like UN, on how important it is to control these chemicals. And of course, later on, even though specifically on Jarvis Bay, even though we had all the approach done according to the regulations, a few years later, we have a massive class action in a lawsuit coming up for $22 million on settlement. So what I want to highlight is all these projects that we've been crossing as engineers, that we've been seeing happening related to PFAS, and all the alternatives that we are following or trying to mitigate, to solve these problems or minimize the impact about contaminations in airports, in areas, industrial areas, or many industrial sites. It's very important to try to understand and, of course, try to predict the future, if we could, in what is the right path to follow. So this same case, it's happening now as we speak about the Westgate Tunnel in Melbourne, where despite everything was done according to regulations and approvals were granted, so the contaminated soil was disposed on landfills that are registered to receive those contaminants, and all the process was followed. Now, Ombudsman is following back on EPA, trying to understand why this was approved without enough information. And again, we see this recurring event of things being speeded up or trying to be sorted without a proper and fully understanding. What we can see as a global operation and universal concern is the decrease on acceptable levels of consumption of PFAS. So if we look into the daily average acceptable levels by the European Food Safety Authority, we see that this was decreased, especially for PFOA and PFOS. The safe level intakes were decreased in 200 and 2,000 times, respectively, since 2008 up to 2020. So we see a trend that is quite obvious, that there are a lot of concern about PFAS. So we should indeed be concerned on having this sites that are contaminated, materials, soils, or areas that are previously contaminated with PFAS. They need to be addressed, but we need to be very careful on how we are doing this. And a lot of awareness is being brought by media, books, movies, articles. So it's quite extensive to see. And since we are doing a lot of research with all the PFAS environment, we see a lot of research coming out, pretty much daily new research coming, not only for how impactful it is, but also looking into possible solutions for these treatments. If we focus, I would like to give a few examples on traditional solutions that we are focusing as an industry, especially the use of activated carbon. As we know, activated carbon has been used for many applications and many absorption or filtration processes. However, when we look into PFAS, it's a whole different game. The activated carbon is the use of activated carbon is extremely efficient, especially when we look into organic compounds. However, with PFAS, there are several studies issuing problems afterwards. So as Malik mentioned, there are options of using traditional solutions like geosynthetic clay liners, which are composed with bentonite and activated carbon as a mix. However, we need to be very careful on which situations we are able to use this kind of materials, because activated carbon can promote the degradation of PFAS and spike the concentration of smaller chain PFAS. So in a sense, we are allowing the contaminants to get in contact with activated carbon, be absorbed, and within this structure, within the activated carbon, it would break through into a more complex structure that is smaller and trickier to be absorbed. So this is one example where we had higher concentrations of PFAS after the treatment with activated carbon. So the degradation was happening and promoting this, making it worse in a sense, instead of trying to sort out the solution, sort out the problem. This second study also shown concentrations 200 times higher on smaller chains compounds after the treatment with activated carbon. And for last but not the least, this is one more example of many other more that are available, where we see a dynamic process of sorption and desorption with activated carbon and other substances. But mainly with activated carbon, we have this problem where we see spikes on concentrations of smaller chain PFASs after the treatment is occurred. So in less than 3 or 4 months, we start seeing some desorption of activated carbon, of PFAS from the activated carbon. So whenever we see solutions being used widely and trying to come to a solution for all cases, all projects, this is something we need to be very concerned. The use of activated carbon widely is not a final solution. We need to understand what are the parameters, what type of contaminants and concentrations, what is the flow, and what is the expected outcome that we need to achieve on each project. So simply using activated carbon for stabilization on site, it's something extremely complex. So at the same time, we have other solutions, other alternatives to destroy PFAS, and one of them is the thermal desorption or thermal destruction of chemicals, in this case PFAS. We've been using thermal facilities widely. However, it's quite limited the quantity of industries or setups that are available for these applications. This is due to the high cost of assembly, of preparation to get one of these facilities up and running. And one other very important fact is that the use of thermal destruction would not guarantee a clean outcome. So we've seen studies talking about the release of toxic substances like fluorine and dioxins, which are extremely harmful as well, as bad as or even worse than PFAS, depending on the case. So it's very, very important to be careful when we are trying to use these widely accepted solutions without fully understanding them. Even though the solution is well known by the market, sometimes it's not fully understood on the theory and all the processes, especially the thermal destruction, where we see a lot of research done, but we don't have a lot of information on large-scale processes. One other application that is more in the sustainable area is the use of reactive barriers. So this is what I could say is one of the most sustainable and eco-friendly alternatives, where we try to diminish any move or remove of the soil. So we are avoiding excavation, transport, disposal, thermal destruction, stabilization, all of these processes that are extremely energy intensive, to use a passive or reactive filter. In this case, we call them permeable reactive barriers. They can be created with several different materials, not only with synthetic materials or granular activated carbon, for example, but we can also use geosynthetics to create these structures. And this is the turning point where we can start seeing some kind of solutions with minimal impact on the environment, obtaining a high capacity absorption and filtration with a minimal impact to the environment and the surrounding areas. The geosynthetics, as Malek already went through briefly, we have a very wide range of possible combinations and applications. But if we start looking into geocomposites, which are essentially two layers of geotextile with an active layer in between, we can use these materials for many different areas and applications. As permeable barriers or filtration devices, these materials are extremely effective to contain contaminants. If we focus only on PFAS, for example, we are able to select what is the main active ingredient and tailor-made it to absorb the contaminants that we have on site, to allow the total capture of the contaminants without reaching the full capacity of the fabric. The ion exchange resin is one of the most common ones, side by side with activated carbon. Both activated carbon and ion exchange resins are used widely for filtration and high capacity filtration devices and systems, but we can also use them inside of these geocomposites to create a permeable barrier for filtration. Ion exchange and activated carbon, they are quite similar in the sense of absorption, but the capacity of ion exchange is quite higher than activated carbon. So sometimes 7 to 20 times, depending on which compound we are looking into. Activated carbon, the ion exchange resin is 7 to 20 times more effective than activated carbon, depending on the situation. And of course, the main idea is to reuse the contaminated soil without having to dispose or transport or destroy these contaminants. So we can essentially wrap this soil contaminated with the geocomposite, allowing permeation of rainwater or introduce more water to expedite the filtration without having to be concerned about the surrounding area or the ground water flow. We have recent studies done with geocomposites with ion exchange, and we can foresee all the strong bonding effect that this material can provide, especially when we look into the main compounds that we found in Australia and different contaminated areas. But we have a very broad range of different compounds, small and large chain PFASs, and all of them are shown extremely high capacity, extremely high bonding with ion exchange resin in a very fast reaction. So even though if we test all these contaminants together, we can also extract them easily with ion exchange resin, reaching extremely high removal levels. We have flow-through units as well, that some other studies, not only by us, but other entities, that testing the ion exchange capacity and how these compounds are able to filtrate PFAS compounds, isolated or mixed from eluate or from leachate from soil or from landfill. And all of them has shown extremely high capacity for the ion exchange resin. Some interesting researchers came across recently showing the comparison and possible prediction of absorption of PFAS on ion exchange and granular activated carbon using the dissolved organic carbon. So there are some equations that we can try to use to foresee what will be the maximum capacity of the material depending on the concentrations and the flow rates that we have on each situation. So there are mathematical models that we can start predicting and give us an initial path to determine what will be the capacity of the absorption of these structures. But of course, each and every situation requires some tests with the specific conditions, so we can understand and mimic exactly what we have on each project. One very important factor that I highlighted before was the desorption on activated carbon. Differently from activated carbon, the ion exchange resins, they have a very strong bond with the contaminants or with this molecules of PFAS. So we can pretty much eliminate or decrease the desorption level with the use of ion exchange resins. With activated carbon, we have higher rates of desorption, which would eventually cause a breakthrough on the fabric, on a GCL that is enhanced with activated carbon, for example. With a permeable barrier, we are allowing the eluate to flow through, and we are retaining all the PFAS to safe levels and minimizing any level of desorption with the strong bond that this material can provide. So this is a safer alternative instead of having to contain the leachate with an impermeable barrier that is enhanced. We can also always eliminate the need of treating the groundwater, the surface water, by having a permeable barrier. And as I mentioned, the main goal or the biggest achievement that we can obtain by using permeable fabrics or permeable geocomposite as permeable barriers is to reuse this contaminated soil, not only for stockpiles or temporary bunds. We can create new elements that need material imported by simply wrapping or creating a permeable layer underneath this contaminated soil to allow the reuse of this resource and pretty much eliminating all the transport, stabilization, and destruction and disposal of all this mass of soil that's been taken from contaminated areas. A lot of cases, we are able to use these materials inside. So, for example, we've seen a lot of contaminations on airports, which are a big example of the application that we have here in Australia, where we use these materials to create new structures by lining them underneath with this permeable barrier. We have other applications as well already here in Australia showing the use of permeable barriers wrapping detention tanks that possibly could receive contaminated eluate. So these are one more application that can be used, but it's pretty much limited to our imagination. I would like to wrap this presentation with this highlighting again the importance of trying to better understand the solutions before we pull the trigger and start using them. Even though we've been using a few alternatives in the past for several years, we need to fully understand what is happening with PFAS before we pull the trigger and start using these solutions. So thermal destruction, all the gases and emissions that are caused by that, the energy intensive situation that this causes, the use of granular activated carbon for stabilization without fully understanding the situation can also be very harmful. So for this, I would like to ask every one of you as engineers to be more careful to the systems we use. We've seen cases where we've been using concrete, for example, to try to do a capping system over contaminated soil. However, it's not fully guaranteed that the desorption or the elevate coming out of the soils could pass or not concrete. Even though it's upstream contamination, we can see there's still studies looking into the gasification of PFAS compounds and the movement upwards. So especially when we use concrete, precast concrete mattresses or pre-impregnated mattresses, there's always the risk of having breakthroughs on junctions. And this is extremely concerning to the surrounding areas when we have PFAS contamination. So in summary, I would like to highlight the importance of fully understanding the solution before we use traditional alternatives, and try to think as well on the impacts, environmental impacts that we cause by using these solutions, not only trying to sort out the problem immediately, but also on what could come over in the future. If it is not by sustainability, if you're not trying to care for this topic, at least think about the cost that you could cause by legal actions or class actions against your clients or public entities that could happen in the future. So in all areas, in all senses, in all directions, we should be looking into more sustainable solutions and more responsible acts by us as engineers. Thank you, everybody. Now we're going to open for a few questions, and it's always a pleasure to be back here.
Thank you, Gus, and a big thank you to both our speakers for their presentations today. Well, now's the time for our audience to get involved, so please continue to ask our speakers your questions via the chat box. And a big thank you to everyone who submitted questions while registering for today. So what we might do is kick off with some of those questions. Gus, sorry, I'll throw the first one to you, even though you've just had the spotlight. And this question came through from Alea, who's here in Queensland. Now, the question was, how do you see the commerciality of PFAS remediation technologies evolving in the next 5 years? And I suppose the question's around what's happening here in Australia and also internationally.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for the question. I think a lot of what was said here shows the trend that we are trying to create on doing the right thing. But in the industry, we see a lot of skeptical movements for these technologies, where sometimes the companies push for a solution without having this fully understanding. If we could try to predict the future, I think we're going to focus a lot in the near future on solutions that have a high, a better protection for the environment in question of energy consumption, CO2 emissions, and the practicality of those alternatives. So, as I mentioned, for the thermal desorption, we need a massive structure industry to be set up to be able to provide this solution. So I think this would probably be phasing us apart from more environmental friendly alternatives that can be dealt on site or with less energy consumption, less water consumption as well. So I think if I could guess in the future, and I really hope for that, is that we can develop more practical solutions that are not only solving the problem of PFAS in specifically, but also trying to deal in a more environmental friendly way.
Excellent. Thanks, Gus. Malik, I'll bring you into the conversation, and I have a question which came through from Brendan Price, I should correctly pronounce. And the question was, how does PFAS from soil enter the groundwater table and then travel through it?
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for the question. This is a very good question. We need to understand the mechanism that will drive the whole process if PFAS enters the soil. So we have to actually consider two possible scenarios. The first scenario is if the soil is actually fully saturated. So in this case, the pathway is kind of straightforward because you have water in the soil and it is saturated. The soil is saturated. The PFAS is within the water basically, so it will enter groundwater very quickly if there is that connection. So in terms of how fast, it will be very fast. But if your soil is non-saturated or unsaturated, which means that you have you have the solid part, which is the soil, but you also have what we call the air phase, the empty voids. There is no water in them. And then you have most likely very small water phase. So in this case, PFAS will not travel fast. It will tend to accumulate with time, and most likely it will be flushed out towards groundwater if there is a wetting event. For example, heavy rainfall, that will trickle through the soil or the soil profile, and eventually you'll get the wetting process taking place, and that might push the PFAS towards groundwater. Once it's in the groundwater, it will travel at the same velocity as groundwater. So that's why it tends to spread at different locations.
Excellent. Thank you, Malik. Gus, David Weiland from Victoria had a question around, I suppose, well, specifically, what is the general timeline from identification of a harmful substance to prohibition, to elimination? So, identifying it, prohibiting it, and then eliminating it.
That's a great question, David. It's in a nutshell, it takes longer than it should. But if we could use an example, maybe from asbestos, where we had here in Australia the prohibition from asbestos and the prediction. We have the law. The laws. It's really hard to predict how fast we're gonna turn this into a prohibition. But in the example of asbestos, I hope I'm not wrong, but I imagine that we are planning to decrease in 10% every 10 years, if I'm not wrong, something like this, on the material that is available in Australia. So the idea is essentially we are probably phasing out asbestos in 100 years, roughly, if we could. Just on a rule of thumb, don't take my numbers. But essentially, especially with PFAS, where we have this contamination with so many compounds, so many materials, I would also I believe that this will phase out slower than asbestos. But it's really hard to pinpoint a time frame, a specific time frame for all situations. I think PFAS, because it's present in so many different industries, so many materials, and then so many different number of compounds, as Malik was talking about, we're talking about 12,000 compounds at the moment. But essentially, just because you have a molecule, if you have one more carbon or one more chain or a slightly different head, then this becomes a different compounds, and the sky's the limit. So the number of carbons and fluorine connections and the heads creates infinite possibilities for PFAS. So I think this is the part that becomes extremely hard to create a unique regulation because this affects the whole industry and the whole country, or globally, if you could say. There are some very interesting documentary coming out recently, probably by the end of the month in STEM, talking about how we contaminate the world. So it's the same as the movie Dark Water. This documentary is also done with Mark Ruffalo. So looking forward to see it. But it also brings the sense of how important it is to develop the regulations as fast as possible to avoid this type of problems to be extended.
Thanks, Gus. Well,
I think just to add to this, the key part is how to regulate. So when you talk about emerging contaminants, that's why we refer to them as emerging. We don't know much about them initially, and then we find out that actually they become harmful. So that take a little bit of time to realize how harmful they can be, and typically the regulation tend to react slowly. But once they react, they will probably cover the most important compounds, but they don't have a framework to cover probably the rest. So it does take time between discovering and then coming up with solutions, because once you discover and you act on regulations, then the next part, which is the lengthy part, is to find a solution how to deal with them. Because they were not identified in the first place, typically it will take much longer to find a solution to remediate those compounds, whether they are PFAS related or not. So I'll classify all these type of contaminants under the banner of emerging contaminants. So that provides certainly a lot of, I guess, headaches in the process. It's a lengthy process, that's for sure. We cannot give a certain timeline, but certainly there's a lot of work aimed at finding a solution that can minimize their future impact.
Malik, a question came in from Maria, and it was around, could you provide some guidance around acceptable levels of PFAS?
I think in one of the slides I had, we have an idea on what is at least available locally. Currently, we have a guideline which, through a document which is called the NAMP document. NAMP stands for the National Environmental Management Plan, and it is basically related to PFAS. It covers the three main ones. The three main ones, that's basically where most of the work has taken place. It doesn't cover the rest. That's, I think, probably one of the weaknesses of that document. So if you look at PFOS and PFOA, for example, PFOA is 560 nanograms per liter in drinking water, and PFOS plus PFHXS was about 70 nanograms per liter. So this is NAMP version number 2, which was published back in 2020. Version number 3 is in the working. It was supposed to come out last year, but has been delayed for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. But yes, we do have some guidelines, and what is really important to understand that these guidelines are typically based on the risk perception. That's why you have different minimal figures now from one jurisdiction to another. So that basically the answer, yes, we do have guidelines currently, but mostly for what we call long chain type of PFAS compounds.
Thank you. Because that was one of the things, I think in one of your graphs you had the levels, and I think there was America, Australia was noted, but looking at the results for the US, we were lower.
Yes, I think in we had 4 nanograms per liter in the slide. Now the US EPA has actually ratified that. The document has been released this month, and it is pretty tight one. So what people need to understand that, for example, if you look at US EPA, it is at the federal level. So what they have released for PFOS and PFOA is 4 nanograms per liter. For PFHXA is about 10 nanograms per liter. In the US, each state has the right to set their own guideline. And if I can give you an example of California, they went even further than the federal guideline, because we are talking about the 1 nanogram per liter type of targets. That's very difficult to actually achieve, but these are the rules they have put in place starting from April 2024. So we are more likely going to see a lot of effort trying to minimize their impact. And I think it goes back after that to how fast the industry will react to come up with solutions to minimize all these aspects in the light of new guidelines. One thing I'm not sure about is whether the Australian guideline will follow that up, but we wait and see.
Thank you.
If I could just add on that, just one other thing that came, especially with the US APA release earlier this week as well. And going back to David's question, if I'm not wrong, on US APA, they plan to phase the implementation. So they set up new limits. They phase the implementation up to 2026, if I'm not wrong. And then they should distinguish, or everything should be implemented by 2029, and all the guidelines, all the limits should be reached by then. So this gives us a good time frame on the implementation. But also one thing Alec was talking about just came to my mind, that United States also added PFAS to the list of on the super fund. So essentially, it's allowing PFAS problems to be treated, consuming financial resources from the government this way. So as Malik said, we need to find a solution, but the problem is sometimes we don't have the resources, the financial resources as a country allocated to that. So this is part of the process. So once we set up the regulations and the limits, we also need to have the funds to be able to treat or remediate these situations, especially that we've been seeing a lot of airports and department and REF bases that are contaminated with these compounds. So we also need to adjust the regulations and also have the legislation allowing us to expend money on this.
Thank you both. Well, Gus, one of the questions that did come in from registration was from Ian Farnsworth in New South Wales, and it was specifically, he asked a question around how has the recent US court ruling against 3M affected funding and opportunities for remediation?
Exactly. So recently we had this U.S. court action, if I'm not wrong, was $127 million in a class action with 3M in the United States. And of course, this opens the Pandora box. It's a lot of resource that should be directed for this type of situation, and it costs a lot. Because usually the treatment of PFAS, the current traditional ways that we've seen on excavation, stabilization, thermal destruction, removal, disposal, all this process create immense cost. So this is why it's very important to try to find solutions that are more sustainable and more viable financially speaking. So I think by this, I think 3M and back in the days with DuPont in the 1950s, 60s, these are pretty much the first big ones that we see pushing the companies, especially the chemical companies, to be more careful with this type of compounds. And it's interesting to see that despite the immense cost, the companies would still produce them, because one could imagine that is because they still make more money than what they would expend with their lawsuit. But saying that, I think it's a very important part of the process to have these legal actions, not just because of the cost, but to promote some liability and push for responsible act, not just by the government, but also by private companies and how they're dealing with these risks.
I've got a question.
If I might just add something, because the question was about how it will affect possibly any work on that. In the context, I'm not sure, but in Australia we are not probably the same level as the US, but the fact that PFAS has been identified as a problematic compound, and the fact that the federal government there added to the super fund scheme means that money will be available from the government to deal with the issues. So that means that there are ways of actually dealing with the remediation, therefore looking at how they can do a cleanup in the short term and the long term. So each jurisdiction works based on what is available. So how 3M affects work in Australia, that's a question mark, because we have different issues here. Similar aspect, but approach is different.
Thank you. Gus, I've got a question for you, which it came through from Dominic. So two parts to this question. The first one, does the absorbed PFAS stay in the ground forever? And if so, does the absorbent material get full eventually? to a point that it stops absorbing PFAS and needs to be removed or replaced?
Thanks so much for that, Megan. Yes, Dominic, yeah, this is a quite common question, very important actually. So especially talking about the permeable barriers, the way that they are designed is to once you reach a full saturation, if you have a constant influx of contaminants, so let's put it this way, so in two separate situations, if we have a mass of soil with known concentration of contaminant, you can design the absorption layer underneath to have capacity enough to absorb all the contaminants that are there. But if you have a constant influx of contaminants coming through, like for example, if you are treating a groundwater that is contaminated using a permeable reactive or what we call funnel and gauge system, then yes, then you need to replace the media to continue to provide sorption capacity. But if we think about the reuse of contaminated soil to build new structures, the main idea is to have this as a final use, so you don't need to replace it. So essentially what we do is calculate what is the total concentration, the total mass or volume of contaminants that are on the soil, and allow this reactive barrier to have capacity enough to absorb everything that is there. So once we reach the full capacity there's no more contaminants on the soil, and the situation is contained, and there's no more risk for the environment.
Thanks, Gus, for that one. I've got another question for you. We are starting to come to the end of our questions, but this question came through from Felicia. And I know that you spoke about the Westgate Tunnel in your presentation, but they've asked any lessons learnt from the Westgate Tunnel project in Victoria. So specifically lessons learnt.
Yes, yeah, that is a quite interesting project that happened very, very recent. So I think there's a lot of expectations about this project because it was probably one of the biggest projects that were involved with PFAS. So we see a lot of impact. The timeline was delayed, the cost exploded, and all this very linked to the problem of the PFAS that was found. So the area there for the Westgate Tunnel, it's above the Cody Island, where we had an industrial fire back in 1991, if I'm not wrong. And then we used a lot of firefighter foam, and that contaminated all the area. So now, once they started excavating the soil, they found a lot of contamination on the soil that was deemed to be disposed as just fuel material. But of course, since it triggered the levels of contamination, it raised a lot of concern. So I think if we could bullet point a few lessons from that, the first one was that the regulation was pretty much developed around the problem. So in this particular case, we saw that the guidelines, acceptable guidelines for disposal of soil contaminated, were pretty close to what we had on the Westgate Tunnel, and one could think that the regulation was created just because of that project with that capacity. So this could lead to some misunderstanding, and it's very risky to take action based on this. Not saying that the regulation was made just because of this project, but it gives this impression to the public. And a lot of the communities that were surrounding the landfills that ended up receiving this contaminated soil were extremely concerned about this. So I think the ombudsman also mentioned on the reports that one thing that definitely was missed was the communication with the regional entities. So for the people that live around the areas that would receive this waste, they should have been notified to clarify what is happening, how is this being dealt with. This is the first point. I think the communication with the public should definitely be enhanced. The second point, the regulation that I mentioned. The third point is based on everything that Malik greatly explained. All the traditional landfill lining system was not designed to receive PFAS. We have calculations looking into what will be the impact to the groundwater, but one thing is for sure, whenever we did the design for that landfill in particular, we did not predict that it was going to be used for PFAS contaminated soil. So it's extremely important to assess the situation before we pull the trigger. So I think there was a lot of pressure and political movements around this project, and this decision may have been expedited more than it should. I think these are the three main key points that I would take out of the West Gate Tunnel. And of course, as I mentioned before, the risk of future impact, even though we follow the regulations, we did what was on the lines, but we still are open to the risk because sometimes the regulation is not up to speed to what we really need and how we should be dealing with this in the future.
Thanks a lot, Gus. Look, I think we've pretty much come to the end of our Q&A today. Probably just to invite you both, if you've got any last or final remarks that you would like to make to the audience. If maybe, Malik, if you would like to, any key takeaways that you'd like the audience to have?
I think, first of all, I'd like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to convey the message to your audience. I think the key from my side is, I can probably summarize it in one single word, is curiosity. You have to be curious about any aspects of the work you do, especially when you are dealing with the so-called emerging contaminants. And the reason for that is very simple, because what works for other type of compounds might not work for an emerging contaminant. You don't know much about it. So you have to do a bit of homework on that before you can go ahead with a solution that will suit a particular site or project. So that's an important part of what we do. What you have to remember that the solutions are provided so to provide a better protection of the environment, and those solutions need to be robust and durable, and therefore you have to really make sure that your design reflects that. So that's basically my message to our colleagues up there.
Thank you. And Gus?
Thank you, Megan. First of all, thank you so much. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Engineers Australia and Malik. It's always a pleasure to be close together with these important topics. I think my main message, the remarks that I would like to highlight, is the importance of trying to do the right thing. Even though we have regulations to follow, we can always go one step further and try to think on, even though following the regulation, we could do a little bit better, trying to get a more environmental friendly solution, try to find a way to minimize carbon emissions, energy consumption, microplastics reduction with all the tires that are moving soil back and forth, gas emissions that could be harmful as well, with, for example, with the thermal destruction. So I think the main message that I would like to get in our heads is try to do the right thing, even though you're just following the regulations. And we hear this a lot with the engineers, that we're just following the rules. But you can always do a little bit further and not only do the more environmental friendly alternative, but also protect your clients against future risks for lawsuits, for example.
Great advice. Well, look, that's all the time that we have for today. So please join me once again in thanking our speakers, Dr. Malek Guaza and Gus Martins, for their time and input. I'd also like to thank Engineers Australia's industry partner, Husker Australia Proprietary Limited, for their support today. I'm also excited to announce that Engineers Australia's 2024 Climate Smart Engineering Conference is the early bird registrations are now open. So please just follow the QR code on the screen for some further information. My final request of everyone is if you could please complete the short feedback form, which is linked in the description box below. By completing that survey, it really does help us to improve and plan our future sessions for you all. So finally, thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next Thought Leaders event. Good afternoon.